Welcome to this Autism Ontario webinar, Sexuality, Gender, Identity, and Consent in ASD. My name is Matthew Lay, and as always, I will be your host. After close to 5 years sitting on this desk, speaking with healthcare professionals, educators, and ASD experts, it is only in 2018 that the issue of sex and sexuality was raised. And it's a very important time to have this conversation. Today, we will be talking about sexuality in ASD, gender identity, as well as the topic of consent. And to do that on the show, we have Jonathan Leef from the University of Toronto Autism Research Centre, Holland Bloorview. It was a bit of a mouthful. Thank you for being here, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Would you consider yourself a sexpert? Is that why you're here?
I'm developing to become a sexpert, but and maybe a gender spurt.
A gender spurt. Okay. Yes. Well, we will touch on that for sure. Before we get started, I got some housekeeping items. If it's your first time at one of our events, what you will notice is that beside us, the video screen, there is a slide window. Slides will be transitioning throughout the event to help inform our conversation. We will be diving into research today, so there are references there. You can get yourself a copy of the slides in the Resource Center. And while you're there, you will note links to a number of other places that you can go to get more information on the topics we are discussing. But a big part of my job is always to get you answers to your questions. To do so, just submit a question at any time in the Ask a Question box. It will come to my iPad, and I will do my best to get answers from Jonathan. Now, we never can get to all of the questions, but we will do our best to get as many in today, as well as follow up with you after the event in some capacity through Autism Ontario or Jonathan himself. And last but not least, if you have any problems while you are enjoying this webinar, click on the Help button. Okay, now with all of that out of the way, let's ask the question. I touched on it a bit, but why are we here today, Jonathan? Why this topic? Why now?
I think that society has evolved, and I think that the issue around sexuality has really been influenced by the internet, social media, the Me Too movement, for example, and the involvement of self-advocates in adults with autism.
Right.
So I think that's become a real a reality for us, and I think that's why it's become an issue that we need to talk about. And clinically as well, we're seeing a lot of issues around sexuality and gender identity come up.
Okay.
And that's really why now. Yeah.
Is it not true that for a long time, a lot of people believe that those on the spectrum were asexual?
I think that was the impression.
Yeah.
Due to lack of social skills or deficits in social skills.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard for parents to necessarily see their child, especially if a child has a disability, as a sexual being.
Right.
So the assumption was, yes, they must be asexual.
Right.
Yeah.
So developmentally slow, the assumption is that would not be developing either.
Yes, and because of the social deficits that are involved in autism. For many years, people with autism were seen as not being very socially motivated. We know that that's not the case anymore either.
Yeah.
So
with that, I understand as well, it came up again for the first time this year, the discussion around gender identity. And I guess the percentage of the ASD population that is, I'm going to say struggling with this, but it's a big deal within the population, correct?
It is, yes. Yeah. So we're noticing there's more and more research, especially in the last 5 years, that's documenting the kind of overlap between gender identity issues or struggles, or non-typical gender identities and autism.
And this is your primary area of research, or where you started here?
It is. So I started from gender identity, and then because of the relationship between gender and sex and sexuality, it was kind of natural progression to start delving into issues around sexuality too.
Right.
Yeah.
Now you brought up the topic or the word Me Too.
Yes.
Which is comes into play around the idea of consent, and this is where it first popped on this desk, was this idea of consent within the ASD community, just due to some of the social issues and other things that are going on. But this is an important topic that we need to discuss.
Yes,
right?
I think that we can't discuss any of these without an overlay of issues around consent and capacity.
Right.
They're so intertwined. So gender, sexuality, and consent. They're just they're so related to each other that we have to kind of bring
it all together in our conversation. And that's the framework. Those are the three topics that we want to be talking about today. And to be clear, we're going to have a discussion about data and what we know. We are going to talk about what's available out there, and so we welcome you to participate by asking us some questions. Now, I am a father of an 11-year-old boy who has not yet had the birds and the bees conversation. So to make myself a little more comfortable on the desk today, as well as making sure that we're all on the same page, we have some terms we were going to want to get comfortable with before we start talking, right?
I think that a lot of in society we're often bit shy to talk about these words, especially sexual words and sexuality. And I often like to just say it. Let's get comfortable because these are this is the reality, and let's just say them. So things like puberty, we have to talk about, especially with our children, around the right names for our anatomy, especially with kids with autism. Things around masturbation, having sex, things around sexual orientation, sexual attraction, and in our world we need to bring up issues around pornography. It is a real reality that we all face on the internet. And certainly if our kids are searching the internet without any parental controls,
they're going to find it. They're going to find them.
Yes, exactly. It's going to pop up. So it is a reality. So even just saying it. And then if we're talking about adolescents and adults, we are going to confront issues of or experiences around fetishes or paraphilias would be the kind of psychiatric term for sexual fetishes, especially in autism. And when it comes to gender identity,
higher percentage of that in autism as well. I mean, it makes sense now you say it based around.
And we'll review that, I guess, in some of the research that I'll talk about.
Perfect.
But
so on the getting comfortable, so gender identity is a topic that doesn't come up in conversation a lot for me. I mean, obviously aware. What do some of these words actually mean that I'm seeing on the screen?
So everyone really has a gender identity. Even though we don't necessarily talk about it, it's interesting that we're confronting the gender identity of masculinity in sports this last week or two. In Ontario. So everyone actually has a gender identity. Why the reason that we're talking about it more often lately is because more people are expressing that their gender identity doesn't necessarily align with what we're used to or with their biological sex. So terms that have come up are like gender variance might be where someone is expressing their gender that wouldn't be socially normal, let's say. For lack of a better term, so they're playing around with how they express their gender. Then another term might be gender queer, and a lot of adolescents or young adults might be identifying like that nowadays. And then there's also a term gender dysphoria.
So, sorry to dive in too deep, but gender queer, would that be homosexual or no?
Not necessarily. So even the term queer now might encompass and include people who are gay or lesbian or homosexual from like a technical perspective. It could be people who are pansexual. That might be another aspect of their sexuality, which we're noticing that a lot of adolescents and young adults are identifying as pansexual, regardless of whether or not they're on the spectrum. So that's why this comes up as well, because these are societal shifts that are happening broadly, and our guys on the spectrum and our people on the spectrum are certainly experiencing these shifts as well.
Okay, so anytime we're talking about children, or really, I guess, anyone within the healthcare system in general, we talk about call it a circle of care, right? You've got your clinicians, educators, and your parents are a huge role. You parents are a huge role. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the roles of both clinicians and parents within this the sexuality conversation.
I think that again, within the realm of our society, parents are always going to play a role when it comes to sex education and what they bring to that.
Right.
So whether it's their own personal histories, religious background, cultural backgrounds, and we can only expect the same from clinicians, the ABA therapists, the teachers. They're coming as individuals with their own baggage, their own history.
Right.
And that history and that identity, their cultural identity, religious identity, will inform how they're going to approach issues of sexuality or gender identity.
Right.
So that's, I think, an important piece to just acknowledge. And it's hard for people to kind of bring this up because of that.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you find that parents who have children identified on the spectrum, since they've gone through that process of having the identification and the acceptance, are more accepting of some of the, some of the things that other people are not as accepting of, some of the gender issues or whatever it might be, or you get a mixed bag? I can't swath it with that brush.
I don't think it's so broad.
Okay.
Possibly when it comes to sexual orientation,
right.
If it's gay, bisexual, lesbian, maybe pansexual. I think that parents of kids with autism, so far from my experience clinically, they are more open-minded. It is quite remarkable. People from all sorts of backgrounds, even if you would assume that they have quite a very strictly religious background, it's remarkable that I've experienced where they're so... It's a non-issue.
Okay.
And I wonder if it's because they've come so far.
Yeah.
And they've worked so hard. And this is the least of their worries.
Yeah.
When it comes to gender transition, for example, that might be, I think that's harder for some parents right now still. And maybe for the same reasons. They've worked so hard with their kid.
Right.
We've come so far. I've cared for them so much.
Right.
And so, but that might be where that might be more difficult, because suddenly there's so many changes that happen physiologically, which I guess we can talk about later too. But yeah,
we will. One of the things that we have to face in this is there's only a handful of specialists as it relates to ASD in general. Now we start getting into sexuality, and that list gets pretty small, right? And so something you didn't say here, but we see it sometimes, and the parents are used to being advocates, is that some clinicians, regardless of their training, are not comfortable bringing up these topics either.
Right, and that's something that I'm really hoping to address, is by challenging fellow professionals and working around that. So a project that I'm working on, for example, is to get information from youth with ASD and disabilities in general. What do they want to hear from their clinicians? What about the person doing the assessment when you're getting ready for the transition years when you're 17 or 18? It's amazing how clinicians don't bring up these things.
Right.
Are you having sex? Do you have a relationship? Are you interested? And how are you managing that? Because I think clinicians are uncomfortable, and they feel like it might not be their area of expertise, even though they are experts in autism. It just might not be something that they're comfortable with. But I'd love to break that down.
Perfect. Okay. So as we start very broad, we on the desk and on these presentations, we generally get more and more focused as we go. And we're about to dive into some of the data and the research and what's available. But as parents and people who care about those that you on the spectrum that you're taking care of, you always go right to the advice. And so we're going to try and get some right away here. Do you have any strategies for how you teach younger children about public versus private spaces that are safe to discover their bodies?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's something that comes up a lot.
Okay.
And there are resources in the list that I provided. There are resources around the public and private. That's one of the main things, especially in some of those toolkits from the ATN or the books around puberty in autism. It is one of the more pressing issues, especially for kids who are just approaching puberty, and even before then, around the right place to masturbate, not in the living room, the right time, and there are really nice resources around that are kid-friendly and parent-friendly around how to masturbate, that you don't actually injure yourself, because there's that tendency as well. So it's probably, if a parent is noticing that there might be some a need to address privacy, in general, privacy is important because it also addresses the issue of consent.
Right.
Other people can't invade your privacy, just like you can't invade theirs.
Right, you're dealing with two things at once.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. It is so related.
So you say is this on the, so this would be on the Holland Bloorview Autism Research Center site?
It would be on the Autism Treatment Network site, but we have that as part of the
links.
The links
that are on the resource center.
Yes, that would be one.
Right now.
And then another one is a book about puberty. That's also on the link. There.
Any watch-outs to? I mean, the rules are the rules in general, consent and whatever. Any watch-outs from, utilizing tools that are built around neurotypical, or the older tools that might have been used for myself or anybody else, or are there any watch-outs, any things to watch out about educating someone on the spectrum about this topic?
I think it is quite specific.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is.
Because someone maybe like you, there was you got a sense of the need for privacy.
Right.
Maybe early on.
Right.
Whereas maybe someone on the spectrum who's 9 years old may not be. And not only that, there might be some impulsivity as well. So there's connection between the social skill of understanding privacy and impulsivity. So yes, I would suggest for those tools, I think the most useful ones would be to address things that are tailored for kids with ASD.
Okay.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's good advice for anywhere. If you can find it, start there.
Yes.
And if you can't find it, Autism Ontario is your source to ask the question to get the answer. Okay, let's talk about what we know.
Okay.
Let's talk about the research, and we are here.
Yes.
So there have been some studies.
Yes.
I'm going to have you start walking us through things now and letting us know what we're talking about here.
So this is really to establish the landscape of what do we know about adolescents and young adults with ASD in terms of sexuality. And so a few studies that I found really interesting, and they were quite informative. Fernandez did a couple studies with adults with ASD, and based on parent report in one study, the majority of their children, they perceived them as having sexual interests. Interesting that 32% of the parents thought that their son or daughter doesn't have a sexual interest, but let's just say that the majority, though, did.
Right.
What were those interests according to those parents? Most were what we would consider heterosexual.
Right.
But a very high, a substantial part, 30%, were interested in both sexes or same-sex attraction, or had same-sex attractions, or weren't interested in anyone else other than actually having their own, what they were called solitary sexual encounters, really probably masturbating. Right? We don't, now this is again based on parent report. Now, a really high percent, almost 30%, had what was described as inappropriate sexual behavior. So that would be like public masturbation, which really really points to that parent asking about the prepubescent child. So it's the earlier that you address it, the better. It might be hard for the parent, but the earlier the better. Okay, you don't want to face suddenly sexuality at the age of 15 because those things potentially could have been addressed in terms of better behaviors, maybe earlier, to avoid that. And so that's what that describes. And in the second study, it was based on self-report by adults. And what was interesting is that the higher the IQ, they actually had more sexual interests. Just something to keep in mind. And then, of course, a substantial majority, over 90%, actually had sexual interests when you actually ask the individuals, not their parents. So that's important.
But also the number of heterosexual interests rises as well.
Yes. So isn't that interesting? Right? So the parents' perceptions versus when you actually ask people with autism. So there is a bit of a difference there. Now, these self-disclosures on these in the study. 5% had same-sex interests. 5% were bisexual potentially, and interesting that almost 24% had fetishes that they were willing to actually say that they had. And so these are some of those types of fetishes that they said that they had.
So the 5 same, 5 both. This is higher than self-identified.
Well, so that it's interesting. It depends which study you look at. The classic version of what, according to paper published decades ago, was that 10% of our population is non-heterosexual. They would be gay or lesbian.
Sure.
And the numbers do vary.
Right.
Statistics Canada, which I have on a different slide, very low rates of like just over 1% that are gay or lesbian. In the United States, there are reports of 2.5%. Overall, is somewhere around 5%.
Okay.
So it's not that different.
Right.
But it depends what study you look at.
Right.
Because the next study I'm going to talk about, you're going to see that it's a huge percent based on self-identified, on self-report by adults with autism.
Before we go there,
yes.
We have a parent that's written in saying, they heard you loud and clear, and the other parent as well, and they've tried, and they know now that their child is not comfortable talking about puberty and sex. Do you have any strategies for how to help foster that sort of safe relationship with someone else so they can get their questions answered? I imagine a clinician should be a safe place. Is there other ideas for this?
In an ideal world, it would be wonderful if we had a sexual education system where this could be facilitated in the public school system. But we don't right now, or at least in our society we don't. I think that's typical, though.
Right.
Isn't that? And I think that's many kids, regardless on the spectrum, not on the spectrum, they don't really want to talk to their parents about this, right? So if a parent can afford a professional, or if they have access to a professional, I would suggest that someone who's safe.
Yeah.
If there's a worker that comes in and helps out, or a respite worker that that the child gets along with.
Yeah.
Now another aspect is maybe that child isn't ready yet. So it's that fine line of I want to bring it up, I want to educate, but maybe they're actually not comfortable because they don't really know what you mean.
Yeah.
So there's that. It's so nuanced. It depends on the child. Unless there are indicators that the kid is actually interested.
Right.
So are you finding things online and you really do want to address and they're uncomfortable? That's a different question.
Right.
And in that sense, maybe speaking to a professional would help.
Right.
Or maybe you get the training from that professional to know maybe how to address it a bit more sensitively. So I think it depends on the relationship, depends on the child. I don't have a direct, direct advice.
Yeah. Don't most teachers, all teachers, get some level, not a professional like yourself, but some level of sexual education?
Yes, I think that is part of the curriculum.
So because one of the tactics that we've heard before in the school is you have that person that they trust. There's that person. It could have been their teacher from last year, whomever it is. Who's generally a good person when you don't have it to go to, I guess if they're comfortable as well. Now I'm giving advice, which I really shouldn't. I'm only the lowly host.
You're a dad.
I'm a dad, expert, so I always think about that. Okay, so let's move on to the next data set. So this is the one you were referring to.
Yes,
so let's get into this a bit.
All right. So this is based on self-report, pretty recent study. And the interesting piece around here is that these adults were mostly diagnosed in late adolescence or adulthood, because we see the mean age of diagnosis was 37 years.
Wow.
So whatever you might think, or the researchers out there that are listening, think of that. Doesn't matter. I think the piece here, it's interesting to hear that, again, we're back to that 5% of same-sex attraction, but higher rate of bisexual attraction. And the researchers weren't clear about what none of these mean. That's why it's quoted.
Right.
But it could be asexual. So remember, there is a higher proportion of autistic adults who are asexual, compared to, let's say, the general population. So it's not.
Has there been any research done in the non-speaking population? This is a parental question.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yes, no, that's an excellent question. There hasn't.
Okay.
Not in the autism world.
Okay.
No. There may be in other disabilities where someone is nonverbal, but don't have a communication challenge. Right. So we're in those physical disabilities.
Right.
But I'm not aware of that research. So far, no, there hasn't been. Yeah.
So, apologize if I'm jumping to the end here, but we've had 3 studies. In each case, we're at we're above StatsCan.
Yes.
But we're at or above StatsCan as it relates to these indicators, self or parental or parental report. what should I take from this? Is this something where, as a parent, I should be of someone on a spectrum? I should just be on the lookout, be more open. What are you hoping that a parent takes from some of this data sets you're sharing?
That's exactly.
The
easy answer is yes.
Right.
But I like to talk, so I'll elaborate. And
that's why you're here.
Exactly. And I think yes, I think that being on the lookout, maybe softening your own expectations. About how they could be expressing their sexuality as they approach adolescence or early adulthood, not being so surprised potentially. I think that's why I'm showing these stats is really to, first of all, encourage our community that people with autism are sexual beings and are motivated to find sexual contact and intimacy. And also that the type of intimacy might not be what you expected.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the take-home message right now. Yeah.
Another study, Georgia Stokes, or is this more of the same one?
This would be, thank you. This is another one that's very recent. And this is where the, some interesting, very, very high stats that I had mentioned earlier.
Wow.
Around non-heterosexual.
Wow.
Yes. So interesting. I think being a consumer of research is important, especially in our community. As parents, is interesting. It was an internet sample. We don't, were they diagnosed in childhood? Does it make a difference? And I've asked these researchers at conferences as well if they know that, and they don't seem to record that in these studies when they're studying adults with autism. So I feel like it would be very interesting to follow up with kids who were diagnosed now that they're 25 or 30. When they were diagnosed, let's say at 2, 3, 4, which is until now more common for our community. And see where they're at in terms of their sexuality. But I think this is just to manage our expectations. Something is different than the rest of the population.
Let's continue on the data here. So we're seeing there's something different, as you mentioned. Likely higher in some capacity, it's a higher percentage, and we haven't even got into gender diversity yet. But and I think you may have given your closing sort of message to parents. But what do you really want us all to take away from what we're going through beyond just that? It is different.
I think my purpose was to start. So it's not just that it's different. It's to start to become more comfortable, and to maybe start thinking of demanding from our systems to address issues of sexuality. So that would be even a bit more bold. And that parents can start demanding this because it's something that's important. I think that's where I'd like to push for this.
And that makes sense. That moves really well into the next. We've got a bunch of questions here. They're flying in actually. And this one, I have my own hang-ups about sex, and I don't want my child to have them as well. How can I help my child have a healthy attitude towards sex and sexuality?
I think that parent is a quarter of the way, a third of the way there, because they're acknowledging that they have hang-ups about sex, and they're willing to even say it. And by acknowledging it, you then can maybe work through that uncomfortableness that you may experience, even just thinking about it, talking about it. The question is, how do you work through that? Can you work through that on your own, or with your partner, or with a friend? Or do you need to take it a step further by maybe reading a book or seeing a professional who is comfortable with sexuality? And working through your own hang-ups, maybe before you start talking. Or will you surprise yourself if you jump in and start talking about sex with your kid, even if you're uncomfortable? Maybe you'll surprise yourself that you'll be less uncomfortable once you open that door a little bit.
Do you have any recommendations on books, or we've asked for here, are there support groups or lines for sexuality with youth on the spectrum? Is there some general places that you would send people?
The Griffin Center has a kind of knows around or addresses issues around non-heterosexuality and developmental disabilities,
Okay.
but also sexualized behaviors in general.
Okay.
They might be a good source.
Yeah.
So the Griffin Center might be one.
Yeah.
Surrey Place does have some services, but I feel like that might be for the one end of the spectrum that might not be the majority. So not yet. There aren't enough resources yet.
Right.
Then there aren't enough clinicians who are comfortable, I feel, with both ASD and sexuality.
Okay.
What you will find, and I must say this, is that there's lots of places in Toronto and in Ontario that address sexuality and gender identity. What, in my opinion, might be lacking, or they could use more training in and understanding, or a depths of understanding, is autism.
Right.
Yeah. And what's involved with autism.
Not the first time we're hearing this, right?
Yes.
We've got some pieces,
Yes.
and it's about how you,
Exactly.
sort of as the parent, bring those pieces together.
Yes.
Okay. I got a question here from a practitioner. I'm supporting an adult with sensory sensitivities.
Mm-hmm.
How can I help ensure that they have safe sex?
So that's I would need to know so much more about the client. What I need to know is, what do they mean by safe sex?
Yeah.
Do they mean contraception, or are they engaging in risky sexual activity?
Right.
I think this also leads into an interesting piece we had discussed earlier, I think, and that I've been wanting to express, is that I see sexuality and sexual behavior, sexual experiences, as part of an individual's dignity and their right to experience sexual activities if they have the ability to consent to those activities in the way they want to.
Right.
And I think that's where this balance between overprotection of adults or youth with developmental issues versus, they're able to actually say yes or no to this.
Right.
So I would need to know more.
Right.
And
okay, but on all of that, so I imagine, just because I am a parent who learns on this desk, and I speak to very intelligent people like you, and that helps me be a better parent when I leave, and sometimes even be a better boss in learning these things. Not about sexuality, that's not what we talk about at work, but in general. So are there things that work for, I don't know, like in this case we're talking about sensory sensitivity. This is not new.
No, it's not.
Right? We're dealing with sensory sensitivities in children for all kinds of different things. Do the tactics and the things that work for a general, call it sensory sensitivity, do they work for sexual in the case of sex or whatever it might be, or do you find, because it is a personal expression of their own self or a dignity matter, that you must deal with them slightly differently?
It would have to be. I mean, I don't want to sound trite, but is it? I think it's on a case-by-case basis.
So it's not. There's no generalities, right?
Not yet.
Okay.
Because I don't. There isn't enough research to know what works, what doesn't, and for who.
Right.
Especially in our population, because our population is so varied. Everyone's so different.
Right.
But I bet you, in the future, we're going to start to figure out who are the subgroups. Maybe that'll work, maybe that won't. What I'm wondering, if we're speaking to this particular clinician, if we're speaking about a sensory sensitivity in wearing a condom, are there other types of condoms that that person can search for that aren't made of latex, for example, if that's the issue?
Yeah. Which sounds different, similar to how you deal with general sensory sensitivities, right? You're looking for other ways, other options, right?
Yes.
Exactly. Okay. So now we're going to move on to gender identity.
Okay.
And as we started, I had to ask some questions, so I'm going to have you walk us through what we're talking about here.
Okay. So when we speak about gender identity, it involves our sex.
Right.
So often nowadays on forms, we don't have the word sex, we have the word gender, which is interesting. But what they're really asking us is, were we born male or female?
Right.
And that's, at least in the scientific community, still we're using those terms.
Yep.
And what sex refers to our biology that we came into the world with, and the biological characteristics that make us male or female.
Right.
Okay. Or at least for people who aren't intersex, that's a whole other can of worms.
Right.
So, and then gender is really the cultural and psychological attributes that someone would say that a male or female has. And then gender identity is what do you feel? So that subjective experience of that gender.
Right.
In your specific culture.
Are there multiple alternate genders, or is it one alternate gender? What is that part?
So that part is stems from where that field around gender identity and gender studies might have they contributed to this proliferation of various gender identities. So there are some people who might feel like a boy today, tomorrow they feel like a girl, and same with adults, they feel I'm a man today. And that's where that term earlier, gender queer, I can kind of go along and I feel a little bit like this, a little bit like that. And it seems to be that's kind of where the field is at right now. At the very least, that's where some opinions are at. And that's why often we'll just think, we'll include that, because it could be an alternate. I don't really feel like a complete male.
Right.
And I don't feel like a complete female. That's what.
Dysphoria.
Yes. So if you think of the opposite of euphoria, we have a dysphoria. Right, so euphoria, incredible elation. Dysphoria, incredible suffering and unhappiness. And gender dysphoria is a DSM-5 diagnostic category of so the DSM-5 being the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Disorders.
Right.
Okay. And gender dysphoria is where there's this disconnect between someone's experienced gender, the way they express themselves, and what someone said that they were, and so they were assigned a boy or a girl at birth based on their sex, but they just don't feel like they fit that category, and it causes them a lot of distress around that. So even if people might feel a bit, I feel like a woman right now, or I feel a bit more masculine tomorrow, it doesn't mean you have gender dysphoria unless you're really upset about that.
Right.
Okay, and the disconnect is really quite upsetting and distressful.
I can imagine. The prevalence is low. Is that in the general population, or is that
the general population?
The general population.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So there's been some media attention
about this. Tons of media attention. Yep. So there seems to be this overlap between autism and gender dysphoria.
Okay.
So this started to emerge in the 90s. People started writing these case studies. Hey, I have this patient, both in kids and in early adulthood. They have autism, and they are also incredibly gender dysphoric. Okay. It used to be called gender identity disorder in the DSM-4. So tons of media attention because of this link. And the reason I have multiple slides with these is because, 3 slides, is because when we look at it through different lenses, when we amongst people who are transsexual or transgender, there seems to be a higher rate of people with autism. And if not autism, then autistic traits based on standardized measures. When we look at in groups of kids and adolescents and adults who are autistic, we're also seeing some gender variance, kind of not necessarily gender dysphoria per se quite yet. We haven't proven that yet, but we're seeing that they're not quite fitting. They don't feel like they fit the gender that they were assigned. So when we look at trans people and then when we look at autistic people, we're seeing very similar kind of patterns. So something is going on. And also gender clinics. I think the most important piece is that gender clinics, the one that here in Toronto that recently closed down a few years ago, in Boston and in Amsterdam, they do see a higher rate of kids coming in who have autism. And it's like, oh, what? Interesting.
And so there is some data?
There is some data.
It's not all anecdotal. So
it's definitely not anecdotal. Here, what I do in my dissertation that I recently defended involved this as well, and I've summarized this overlap. So we're seeing that their two diagnoses often go together. So 4 to 20% basically of an overlap of diagnoses. So they actually have gender dysphoria and they really have autism. Both are going together. So you can see how spread out that is, 4 to 20%. So that's kind of my summary. Basically, it's a higher than expected prevalence. Of this.
And this, so before we go, but this comes with a whole, this is new. I had to ask questions, you know what I mean? Like, I don't understand the terminology, let alone how to to be a parent of someone who is struggling with this if I myself have not been through it. This must cause a whole other set of concerns and wrinkles within the community, I assume.
Yes, I think that's what's happening. Parents are struggling, and I think clinicians are struggling. Clinicians who understand the potential vulnerabilities that autistic people have in terms of their own identity or their emotional maturity. Even though they're 25, maybe their social and emotional maturity might not be 25.
Right.
And if they want to transition and change their bodies and their names and identities, I think it's worrying some families. Can they make those decisions?
Right.
Then there's the flip side around dignity and adults with autism who are very capable, and even if they're not as mature as we would think that they should be, maybe they're capable, just as capable.
Right.
Right. And so I think there's a tension.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's an answer yet.
Okay.
But there certainly is a tension.
So on that note, I think it's a good time because you brought it up again. I had a question sitting here. Are parents of ASD youths more aware of these realities than medical professionals? How and where can parents, where would you suggest that parents who believe they are, clearly, this one does, refer medical professionals for the accurate, helpful information? You're talking about data that is less than 10 years old, and in some cases, like last year, this year, there's no way that the GP or some of the other people have access to this. So where do you recommend parents point their practitioners to?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think that to the relevant, I guess, journals, autism journals, or bring them the articles or the abstracts of the articles.
Yeah.
I'm happy to share those articles. We can put that on links to that, or maybe PDFs of those articles. And that's one way. I think that from a systemic way, that's what I'm hoping that there are multiple initiatives in Ontario right now where we could address these, really speaking to the practitioners out in rural Ontario, out in Sault Ste. Marie, and maybe educate them. This is something that should be on your radar.
Right.
I think that the fact that there has been media attention is very useful. So I think that those would be my direct kind of advice for such a thing. But I think because parents are so used to being so active, then if you feel confident enough to be active like this, bring it to your GP and say, read this.
Right.
Or, the GP probably won't want to read the whole thing, so abstracts are great. Just
Abstracts, that's the rule.
Yes, I think that's what I can think of off the cuff right now.
So, as it relates to issues around transitioning genders, I'm assuming in general, well, I shouldn't assume anything. So, question straight up, who can I connect with about some of the issues around transitioning genders? What would you recommend?
Okay. Before I address that, I just want to emphasize also that I think the medical field right now, at least in Ontario, is encouraging patients to be involved in their own care, and they're supposed to be more patient-centered, child-centered, family-centered.
Yeah.
So for the parent who asked the previous question, that GP, they should welcome your input.
Right.
That would be the ideal world. That is the model that is being practiced in Ontario right now, or at least should be practiced, where the patient is very involved in doing the research, bringing the evidence.
Yeah.
And I think that should be embraced.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, yes.
I'm going to give my answer on this too.
Please.
Is that
Yes.
you know how many times I had this question about, when I say that question at the beginning of an event, is like, why are we talking about this? How did you get here? And the answer is the same as you gave to me when we were talking before. I'm not really sure how they sort of found me. So, Autism Ontario. This is one of the things that they do. This is one of the things that the organization is built for, is as these topics and as your concerns grow and gather, is finding people like Jonathan who they can bring to the desk here today, get in front of parents, and just connect you with people. So if ever you don't get a clear line answer on a question such as this or anyone, go to Autism Ontario. They will always do their best to find you those hard to find resources in the communities and the experts and whatnot that you can get in touch and speak with. Did you have another point on that and I just jumped in, or?
I didn't have, but I feel, do we have to address the parent who just asked about
transgender.
Yes.
Sorry. Yes. I mean, we can. If you have an answer for that differs from Call Autism Ontario, then yes, please.
So right now, could you repeat the question?
Sure.
Just to make sure that
who can I connect with about some of the issues around transitioning genders?
Mm-hmm. So there is a clinic at Sick Kids.
Okay.
I believe it's still open. Again, my worry is around the piece of autism that I feel isn't being addressed.
Yeah.
And because the movement right now is to be the affirmative aspects of it. So affirming right away, very few medical appointments, and parents are often not involved.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's ideal for people, for adolescents or adults on this. Well, adults you're fine, but if a child or adolescent is on the spectrum, parents are likely more involved in their care.
Yeah.
So I do have names of a couple people. I do have a small private practice that where I do see people, but also I do have names of a couple other practitioners in the city that both have that training and understanding of autism and transitioning and can help the transition with the proper support by understanding autism. But we're talking about 3 people in the city who have the both together.
Yeah, he's coming in anonymously, but I do think Autism Ontario has a way of tracking it back, so maybe you can.
Yes, and I have my email is on the front.
Right.
So
we will be giving out your contact information. Okay, final thoughts on gender before we move to consent.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that you want to share that we haven't gotten into?
I mean, this is a cool study, and I love this study because it kind of gives an interesting framework for why. Why could there possibly be an overlap?
Right.
And I've done a visual here for it. It just summarizes her study. Bejerot, she's out of Karolinska in Sweden, and she calls autism maybe a gender-defiant condition. Why? Because she found that males and females with autism had fewer physical and physiological characteristics that were typical of those of males and females.
Huh.
So if it was shoulder to hip ratio, if it was quality of voice, and if it was the digit ratio, so your your index finger and this fourth finger, the ratio tends to be different for males and females.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that both males and female adults on the spectrum were kind of less like their typical ones. That's why the arrows are towards the middle.
Huh.
So it's kind of cool. Now, not everyone is like that, but I bet there must be a subgroup of autistic people who are. And if you think anecdotally of the very skinny, high-pitched voice kid who comes in, and it's like, oh, interesting, very interesting. Or a bit of a masculine girl who comes in, and I wonder if that's what she found. So that's why I wanted to address it, because it kind of gives a nice base of, or we're trying to explain, why is this?
Yes.
Because I feel like a lot of the explanations prior to her study were psychological. Oh, it must be a social skill issue. Right. It must be they had more female therapists, for example. But maybe there's something more fundamental here.
Yeah. And this is the start of that, only 2012.
Yes, exactly.
That did occur.
Yes.
I got a question here, and then we'll move on to consent.
Okay.
This is a good one. I'm going to say right off the bat, good luck with this one.
Okay.
How do you talk to your children about what is reality and what is not reality online? For example, a youth who watches pornographic material in which a pizza delivery guy delivers pizza to a fraternity house. After watching the video, now the teen wants to become a pizza delivery guy.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example.
Yeah.
I think so. That parent's question also fits really well into where our society is at right now in terms of the access to porn.
Yes.
And teaching our kids the reality of porn versus the not so reality.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that in the way adolescents even act sexually in real life. Mm-hmm. They might be acting out certain things that they might have seen first through pornography.
Yes.
So that family shouldn't feel unique in the sense that this is something that I think we're all grappling with in our society right now. Now, does your child have a difficulty with reality and not reality more generally?
Right.
Is there a way to also show more, or to test this out when they watch other things on YouTube?
Yeah.
Reality versus not reality. And maybe first I would want to understand what it is about the pizza delivery guy. Maybe that's where it's amazing how many assumptions we all make and then we don't ask the questions.
Right.
What is it about being a pizza delivery guy? Is it so you can have sex? Is it so I can see the pretty girl? Is it because I get to be out there and I never even thought of being a pizza delivery guy?
Yeah.
And it's just kind of cool?
Yeah.
We don't know. But I
Right.
think asking that might be helpful in then for that parent to then start addressing what the real issue is.
Yeah.
Is it about the porn? Is it just getting access to people? Is it seems cool? We don't know.
Right. And there are so many outside of porn, so
Yes,
many unrealistic
exactly.
ideas
Yes.
of what does what.
And porn is just something else we're seeing on a screen. Maybe
Right.
that type of
Looking at it that
message.
lens,
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about consent. It's important,
Yes,
and
yes.
and we are getting to it here.
Yes.
So, break it down. Age of consent. Start at the beginning.
Okay.
All right.
So in Ontario, we really don't. In Canada, the age of consent for sexual relations is age 16.
Really?
Anyone under age 16 isn't deemed to be have the capacity to consent to sex. It used to be 14, and maybe 10 years ago, I believe, they changed it to 16. But there are exceptions.
Okay.
And the exceptions have to do with how much older or younger the person is.
Right.
And not only that, is that person in a position of power? So even if someone is 14 and their counselor at camp is 15, they're not deemed to be consenting to such a relationship, the 14-year-old, because there's a power differential.
Right.
Now, and so exceptions are important, so we have to keep these in mind.
Yeah.
And then, so the other exception would be with really much younger kids, like 12 and 13 on the next screen, would be if they're close in age, then they potentially could consent to sexual activity. Okay. So, and then it brings. So I really got that from this is Canadian law.
Yep.
It's accessible online. Now, what I want to talk about here, I lay this as the foundation for us, but then knowing our guys, they could be professors with the emotional maturity of a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
And that's where I think we feel protective.
Yeah.
And that's all. And that's where I think back to that conflict and keeping that in mind when it's all great that we know that they're sexual beings, but can they consent? And I think that's where we have to. It's a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
And what if? And I think it might be also hard for a parent to realize, ooh, they can actually consent. Though.
Right.
Even though I feel like they might be young, they can.
Yeah.
If that person is within those parameters.
Right.
So what I call the emotional age, and I think that's kind of something that we talk about in our community a lot, about that intellectual age, but that disconnect with that emotional age.
Are we seeing the reverse as a problem as well, with the inability to maybe recognize certain social indicators, facial or otherwise, body that those on the spectrum who are sexually active can get themselves in trouble by not reading? Yeah.
I think that's another aspect that we didn't cover today, and I think we could have an hour only on that.
Sure.
We have a lot of young adults on the spectrum who are now the age of majority, above 18, and they see that person looks great on the subway or on the street, and they're staring, and especially in the era of Me Too, I think our population might be at a higher risk of getting into trouble.
Right.
So that's where early on addressing the social aspect is probably really important.
Okay, so this is a question, like by a parent. How do you address consent given the added vulnerability of the group?
Right.
And it sounds to me like, unfortunately, we have not been talking about it for way too long. Mm-hmm. And it's important to, early on within social education, I guess you would call it, is that this becomes a focus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So an example that comes to mind is the 9-year-old or 10-year-old who has a 10-year-old boy who has a girl in the class who's always been really nice to him since kindergarten.
Right.
And now he has kind of a crush.
Yep.
But now he's kind of creeping her out from her perspective.
Right.
And he means no harm.
No.
He just really likes her.
Yeah.
So that's where those skills, that's where it kind of comes out, because I don't see that as very different as the 24-year-old who's like, she's so nice and pretty, and I just want to talk to her.
Yeah, no one else is nice to me. This girl's
yes,
I mean, we see it.
Yes, and then it becomes creepy rather than understanding where that individual's coming from.
Yeah.
Right? And unfortunately, we can't change society very easily, which would be much nicer and much easier if other people could have empathy for him,
right,
rather than be fearful.
Just labels too, right? Like I think of obsessing. Like I'm sure it can become obsessive.
Yes.
You get into the stalking.
Yes.
And you know, in this day and age.
Yes.
Very challenging. But lots of work ahead. You've got some ideas.
Yes.
Clearly.
Yes.
And that is.
So I mean, that question is so pertinent, because the very last point there about involving autistic adults or youth might really help us figure out where we should be taking this.
Right.
But also, I didn't want to come on here and talk about the fears of the young adults, so parents are fearful that they might get in trouble.
Right.
Around this. I think that we should, in the future, address this in a whole hour about the things that young adults may face because of these tendencies.
Yeah.
But I feel like we can't address that without laying the groundwork.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what I was hoping to do today, is laying the groundwork from what we know so far.
Yeah. Do you know, being that you come from gender was the beginning of your I guess professional sort of research, if there's more of that being handled within the school system in Canada and Ontario as part of the sexual education curriculum?
Gender identity is.
Gender identity is?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is. There is a push.
I have a parent here who says that they don't know what's being taught in the school about sex and sexuality. How do they go about finding that out? Is there a reference of what should be taught, or?
I have to admit, I don't know the school system very well anymore.
Okay.
But I think what directly asking the teacher or the principal would be really helpful.
Yeah.
If for some reason they're unable to, potentially asking if there's an autism team.
Yeah.
At the board, asking them to find out.
Right.
If the child has an EA, maybe asking the EA to find out.
Right.
The parent should have a right to know what's being taught.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so normal parental advocacy, there's a lot on the Autism Ontario website, and because we're not live here, we're getting questions only, and there may be an answer to that question that the team has that we'll get back to you with very, very, very shortly. So we got some more resources that are on the screen about this particular topic to help get you educated as parents and places to go. You brought up the Griffin Center. That's in our resource section as well. Are there any resources here that we did not talk about that you feel are of particular, call it, importance that you want to draw attention to?
I think the Teach Consent is a nice resource around, because the consent isn't only about what's done to you, it's about what you doing to others.
Right.
So breaking it down. And the puberty, the forthright guide to puberty, very concrete, really designed for this population, really helpful. So and the toolkits from Autism Speaks are very, very helpful as well. It's very autism friendly, practical, accessible, and you can get that online and print it out, and really helpful.
Well, I know as a parent what I've taken from today is as I we kind of made it as a joke. I haven't had the birds and bees conversation yet, but it is coming up. Is there is a whole lot of research I need to know, and I need to go into all of this with an open mind. I'm hopeful that you guys took the same from this. Before we shut down for the day, is there anything that you'd like to leave us all with, whether it be your moment of Zen or a key message for our audience?
My moment of Zen. I'm looking forward to moving for more research in Ontario around this, and advocacy, and coming together more as a community, so to be able to kind of come up with the real things that are important. And so because all the questions and the topics could be discussed for hours, each one. And that's my moment of Zen, is that I think that can bring us together as a community of parents, of advocates, of clinicians, and professionals. So I feel like that's a positive. And I think we've broken the seal
We have, and in the absence of the hard data and actual rules, that's the best thing. Let's get together. Let's opening up this dialogue is just going to be helpful for everyone, including your children. And so let's open up the dialogue, and I'm sure we will get more best practices and more ideas out of it. So that's unfortunately all the time we have is exactly 1 o'clock. Any of your questions that were not answered live today, someone will aspire to get back to you, Autism Ontario or our guest today. This event, if you found it informative, interesting, and feel that there are others, maybe those clinicians, maybe teachers or educators, those in the care circle that would find it valuable, you can go ahead and share this link. It will be archived and available on demand by tomorrow, if not Monday morning. Other than that, on behalf of Autism Ontario, myself, I'd like to thank you for your participation today. Thank you, sir.
Thanks
and we'll see you next time on our next Autism Ontario event.